Welcome to Through the Glass Columns, your weekly Wheel of Time read along podcast. The Wheel of Time turns and ages come and pass, leaving memories that become legend. Legend fades to myth, and even myth is long forgotten when the age that gave it birth comes again.
That is your host, Greg, who somehow still knows very little about the Wheel of Time, even though he usually pretends otherwise.
And that is Tylor, our resident expert, who makes sure you know how much he knows about the Wheel of Time.
It's a lot. Join us each week as we continue our journey through Robert Jordan's great fantasy epic, exploring the books, the television show, ill-advised discussions of visual media on a non-visual podcast, and so much more. Although actually not, it's just that.
Yes, all that and actually nothing else as we travel on, and I know what this means now, through the glass columns.
Yeah, he really doesn't know all that much.
No, you don't know that much. Wednesday, the final reading chapter of the Fires of Heaven. There's fire, there's Adams, there's just a whole lot of wizard stuff. Hello, everybody, and welcome back to Through the Glass Columns, your weekly read-along Wheel of Time podcast, doing one last reading week before the summary week on the Fires of Heaven. Can you believe it? In terms of reading, we are now kind of 1/3 of the way through this series. I honestly didn't think we'd make it past the 5th chapter, let alone the 5th book. So, joining me laughing rudely before he's been introduced is
Fair.
Tylor, the man who knows everything about the Wheel of Time and is mildly irritated by all the things I've forgotten just since last week. Also, I'm Greg. But Tylor, how's life? How are you doing now that we've finished another book?
I'm very tired. I almost corrected you when you said it was Wednesday because we don't record on Wednesdays, and I was briefly confused. Largely, things are really good. I think that once we get to kind of this point in the series, Robert Jordan is no longer just table setting. He is able to table set and push the plot forward in really big, interesting ways. In a way that I find really fun to be figuring out what is hints for the future and what is being resolved all throughout these couple of chapters we read this week. So I'm excited. We get to do fun stuff, and guess what? We're diving into an even bigger Wheel of Time book in the next one. So don't be too upset about how long this one took. It's gonna be a bit longer. Any thoughts on these two chapters overall? Were you pleased by how the book ended? Were you surprised by anything in it? What was kind of your overall impression of finishing this book, bearing in mind we shouldn't spoil anything from the second chapter, which was quite brief?
I think my feelings from last week generally continued, that this book was on the uptick, and I thought the kind of big confrontations and kind of action in these last couple chapters. And we are, of course, in case people are lost and confused, we are reading, I forgot the numbers.
55 and 56.
55, the threads burn, and 56, glowing embers, plus a little prophecy thingy bob. And so I would say largely I left this book satisfied, and I think next week I'll have more to pontificate about was there enough at the end to justify the page count? I don't know. I want to mull on that, and we can talk about it. But generally speaking, leaving on such an up note left me satisfied. And, again, imagining myself in the mid-90s, I can see why you would just count down the days until the next book came out and continue on.
Yeah, it was a very wonderful thing to be able to count down the days until the next Wheel of Time book came out. I only got to do it twice, and then there was a really long gap, but it was a fun experience to kind of sit in it and not know what was coming next in a way that you will never get to experience, and I'm very sorry for you for that. I almost feel like when people watch Breaking Bad or some shows like that, I'm like, you need to take a week in between episodes and like do fan theories on the internet. I feel like you're missing out on a little bit having done this so far later, but we'll get over it. Just one quick reminder to our viewers before I dive into what will likely be a fairly long summary of the first of two chapters. Today,
Viewers, nobody should be seeing me. How dare
right.
you, sir?
Listeners, I am so
I
sorry.
do this podcast shirtless because it says specifically video is not being recorded. How dare you?
Valid. Just a reminder, this is the last week that we will be reading anything from this book, but next week we will be discussing the book overall, talking about prophecy, kind of doing our wrap-up. So just be aware we will kind of be dancing around, as Greg just did, discussing our overall feelings on the book. We want to save some stuff for the next time we hang out. Otherwise, Greg will never spend time with me in the next 2 weeks. So I suggest then, unless you have any last thoughts, we dive into chapter 55, The Threads Burn. He just got out his book, so he doesn't have thoughts. Rand pursues Ravin, who repeatedly strikes at him and flees. He thinks that he has failed Elaine while also thinking about Ilyena and all that he has lost. Rand is faced with a number of Murdrail, and he freezes them using a weave that he clearly learned from Lews Therin. He lets some servants leave after he destroys all of the Dark Friends who are attacking them, and then he senses Ravin channeling and barely avoids a bar of balefire, despite the fact that Moraine said that even the Forsaken were afraid to use it. Because Ravin is using it, Rand strikes back, also using balefire. He senses that Ravin fled through a different kind of gateway than the one that he was using earlier, and he channels that type of gateway by instinct. On the other side is a nearly identical version of the palace, and we are led to believe relatively quickly that this is Teleron Riode. He realizes he has stopped hearing Lews Therin's voice as soon as he channeled the balefire, and as he starts to contemplate this, he starts to lose his self-image and begins to become insubstantial, flickering between himself and Lews Therin before eventually reminding himself that he is Rand. He eventually realizes that this was an attack by Ravin, and he experiments with doing the same thing to some flowers nearby, but eventually he channels, summoning lightning, and when he realizes he hasn't killed Ravin, he charges after him. We then switch to Nynaeve's POV, who barely dodges balefire, not knowing whether it was thrown by Rand or Ravin. She hasn't seen either of them and thinks that she is only holding on to her anger by tapping into Moghedien's anger through the Adam. Moghedien is sick from trying to escape, declaring that the men are now here in the flesh, and so they will overpower both of them, and Nynaeve thinks this gives her an advantage, but Moghedien says that they have no chance unless Nynaeve was truly linked to her, and she is contributing nothing at the moment. Moghedien says that they must flee, but Nynaeve threatens her, and when Moghedien refuses to move, Nynaeve thinks that she can't make herself hurt her enough to make her cooperate, but eventually she suspends Moghedien in the air and makes her feel nettles before remembering a previous punishment that she was given in the Two Rivers and making her feel that. Moghedien eventually agrees to help, despite the fact that she thinks that is pure death, and they hear thunder and footsteps in the distance as Nynaeve pulls Moghedien towards the noise. We switch to Rand's POV as he looks around a corner, then destroys some soldiers made of stone that Ravin has created, and then the air around him becomes water. After barely managing to hold onto his breath, he falls to the ground, and he nearly reopens the wound on his side as he does so. He rushes towards a fading gateway, not knowing where it leads, but he realizes that he has been drawn into a trap, and Ravin begins to change his form again, and Rand shouts wordlessly. Nynaeve's POV again, she rushes around the corner, having just spotted Ravin, and she stops herself from going too fast, and then runs upstairs after him. She almost loses him, but is able to follow the threads of balefire that are being thrown in his direction, and both Moghedien and Nynaeve are terrified, but they continue onward, with Nynaeve barely being able to stay angry enough to stay in the dream. Nynaeve worries that she won't be powerful enough, and then she realizes she's stalling herself, and when she spots Ravin staring at something, she channels a wall of fire towards him. She clearly burns him badly, but he angrily turns towards her as Moghedien seems to give up. We switch to Rand's point of view, who sees the fire burn Ravin, freeing Rand to channel balefire with all of his power. Ravin is consumed, but Rand isn't sure whether or not he has fallen. We switch to Nynaeve's POV, who realizes she is about to die when the balefire hits Ravin and she sees him disappear. Moghedien weeps with relief as Nynaeve sees Rand, hoping he doesn't kill Moghedien, but Rand says he thought it through, and he thought it was either Nynaeve or someone else who had channeled, and then he asks where they are. Nynaeve tells her briefly about Teleron Riode, and then warns Rand against coming here in the flesh ever again. She heals him, but again she cannot seem to affect the wound on his side, and Rand eventually confirms Ravin's death with her, and Nynaeve tells him to leave Teleron Riode. He does agree to go, but he refuses to promise that he won't return. He asks Nynaeve to tell Elaine not to hate him, and then says that Lan was right and to tell Elaine to forget all about him, and passes on Lan's message that she should find someone else because he has. Nynaeve is stunned by this, and Moghedien calls him a very dangerous man after he leaves Teleron Riode. Moghedien says that she is Well, I don't know what I wrote there. Oh, she says she was helpful, and Nynaeve makes her then drink fork root so that she won't be able to follow her. As Moghedien begins to fall asleep, Nynaeve says that Moghedien knew about Birgitte and Fowlane, and she also knew that Siwan was with them, and so she must be with them in Saladar, and as Moghedien realizes that she is caught, she faints. We switch to Rand's point of view, who observes less damage in the palace than he expected, and he sees a number of Trollocs fighting with Aiel, and they are eventually broken by large lightnings being channeled, and he is surprised by this because there shouldn't be any other channelers left alive. Eventually he spots Aviendha and Mat, and even Asmodean, thinking that all of them have been killed, but then he realizes that the balefire burned Ravin back in time, as described earlier in the book, and so he was out of the pattern before he killed them. They are surprised that he is so excited to see them, but then when he sees the bodies of a number of maidens, he loses most of his enthusiasm. Rand explains where he went, and Bale reports that the battle is won, and Rand orders that all of the Trollocs be hunted down and Ravin's men be watched. This is a big ol' action sequence, so I'm not sure how much we'll have to say about it, but I thought it was one of the better executed action sequences that we've seen so far. It was much easier to follow than a lot of the, Eye of the World or the Great Hunt, when the characters weren't really aware of what was happening, and we hadn't really had, a truly big one-on-one battle in a little while, other than Nynaeve and Moghedien. It was really fun to see this play out. What were your thoughts?
I would largely agree with that the choreography was nicely laid out, and it was, it kind of had some factors to it that required I paid close attention, that I couldn't just kind of do the skim to see who wins. That, the idea that they're in Teleron Rio, the idea that there's this much balefire, then the kind of cat and mouse of Nynaeve chasing Ravin and Rand, all of that kind of worked to make me pay a little closer attention to any parts that I kind of would zone out for. And it was largely effective in that I felt tense. I didn't know what was going to happen. I didn't, having lost Moraine a couple weeks ago, I was not expecting to raise the body count significantly. And I think I'd already basically predicted that everybody who was dead would stand back up. I didn't have how, just to be very clear, but I kind of assumed they weren't really gone. And so I don't think I ever really expected Nynaeve to not make it out of this chapter, but it was still kind of that tension in a positive way.
Yeah, I think the thing that Robert Jordan has done really well at this point in the series is I think that I am no longer worried about at least the Emmons Field 5, as I call them, making it out of any given book, right? It doesn't seem like Robert Jordan is in the business of doing the Game of Thrones thing where he kills one major protagonist in every book. On the other hand, I think what Robert Jordan has done really effectively is he's made sure that all of the victories so far in this series have some sort of real significant cost to the characters. And so I think that's why I agree with you that tension kind of hangs on even if you're not really worried about the body count. I think it's because I'm as worried about what is going on in Rand's head and how is Nynaeve's kind of situation with Moghedien going to resolve, that I'm not worried about them killing Ravin. That feels like the foregone conclusion, but I'm worried about kind of everything that happens around it, and that's why I'm kind of intrigued to read this in a lot of detail, as you described. Either feel free to respond to that, or there is a lot of Rand and Lews Therin hop back and forth in this section that I think is very interesting, and I'd love your thoughts on that as well.
I think it is important in terms of dramatic tension that he's thrown off kilter so that, it's not just showing us this madness that we've been hinted at, but to show that, he's not at 100% so that there's a little bit of that tension of will he overcome or will he pay a hard cost. So I liked it, and I liked the back and forth. I was a little confused about the bit that you referenced in your summary where it's like he struggled, but then he realizes it was a type of attack that I want a little more detail on that. But generally, go ahead. Go ahead.
I was just going to jump in. I think that is one of those things that we get zero detail from Rand, but I think what we can piece together is that is basically the more extreme version of what the Wise Ones have done to Nynaeve a few times, where they have kind of forcefully changed her clothing or altered the way that she looks. It seems like that was that same kind of thing, but striking directly at his identity as opposed to just what he is wearing. But that's as much me kind of surmising from the text as it is getting the detail, and I agree, it's not super clear.
And I think that goes back. Well, I mean, I could still say I hate dreams, and so I just don't like any of this. But like, I do think that there's also a play here about the fact that actually, what came to mind is Doctor Strange and how Doctor Strange has the mirror dimension, and it's like we're there but we're not there. Feels like the right way to kind of read these spaces, and so it was almost like at times I forgot they could use their mind to change things.
Yeah.
But then we also have this idea that they actually went there in the flesh, and how that's really dangerous, and that should be seen as like entirely different than coming in the dream world.
And I think what almost happened to Rand is probably where that kind of originates, right? Because we assume that if the same attack had happened to Nynaeve, she might have lost her sense of self, and then when she woke up, she'd be Nynaeve again, assuming she was able to wake up. Rand, on the other hand, I don't know what it looks like if someone who is physically in Teleron-Riod takes on a different form and loses their identity. Like, could he have been Lews Therin permanently is a really kind of weird and scary question to be asking in this. The other thing I want to give Robert Jordan credit for is I think because this is a battle in Teleron-Riod where Rand is completely kind of unfamiliar, it really does feel like this is a situation where Rand basically lost the entire battle were it not for Nynaeve, and I think that's really important for maintaining the dramatic tension for the next 10 books, right? Rand can't just be charging in and killing Forsaken without any plan, because they need to be big villains for quite some more time, and so having Rand kind of basically lose were it not for the luck of Nynaeve showing up, I think is really effective by him, both in terms of where it puts Rand now and how it positions him later on in the series.
Well, and I'm going to agree and then read it from the Nynaeve side, which is we've been talking for a few weeks about how she seems to just sink lower and lower and lower, and it actually gives her that space to again be the expert, both in saving the day, but like she understands Teleron-Riod better than Rand, and so can use her expertise. I think she also heals him, so it kind of takes you back to that wisdom role again, and so all of that kind of helps establish her in a dominant dynamic again, even though I think everybody knows it's kind of brief, but it is a meaningful passing moment, not just a passing moment.
Yeah, and I think as we kind of switch into Nynaeve, because I think we have kind of covered all of my main points, at least from the first Rand POV, there's a really interesting moment where Nynaeve and Moghedien are kind of arguing about what it means to be in the flesh and whether that makes them more or less powerful. And there's a really interesting kind of moment where I have a hard time with with Nynaeve's interactions with Moghedien in this section, because Nynaeve is not quite fully letting us into what she is thinking about Moghedien and whether, like, I think because we're supposed to maintain the surprise for the end of the chapter, but it really left me feeling like I got into Rand's head a lot in this chapter, and Nynaeve, I felt like I was kind of reading narration that happened to be from her perspective. I felt this was less Nynaeve in the narration than I was expecting, given how kind of pivotal her fear of Moghedien had been throughout this book.
I don't think that's wrong, but I'm going to retcon that to be that so much more of her is taken up by the maintenance of her kind of control, whereas Rand can kind of split his attention and offer insights or spend mental energy thinking. It's kind of like, to me, she's just totally engrossed in trying to maintain control and be a part of this fight. So I don't know why I feel like I need to offer that defense, but it kind of works as an explanation for me.
I actually really like that defense because it makes me compare the way that Nynaeve has Moghedien in the back of her head with the way that Rand has Lews Therin in the back of his head, and how they're kind of interacting with those things very differently in a way that clearly almost costs Rand. And Nynaeve, on the other hand, seems to be managing this really well, even if I wish I had a little bit more of her internal monologue about how and why she's handling things the way she is. Other than that, though, boy, do I not have a lot to say about Nynaeve and Moghedien, right? Moghedien is afraid. She very clearly thinks that both Rand and Ravin are much more powerful than her, and we're getting a little bit of the hints at things that Lanfear has said about her before. Moghedien is kind of known as the Forsaken who won't strike until everything is in a perfect position, seeing the Forsaken afraid, I think is supposed to put the fear of God in us as we're seeing Rand and Ravin fight, but I think it also is a really interesting character moment for someone who has just been so evil to see what it looks like when they're almost too scared to be evil.
Yeah, I find myself, and I don't think I've confessed this on air, even though I've thought about it like multiple times. Like, I have trouble latching on to Moghedien, and an emblematic problem is I keep thinking she is male for some reason. Like, when you get to your summary and you're like, and Moghedien blanks her whatever, I was like, wait, what? Her? Like, oh, right. Like, she's... And so I don't know if that seems to be more based in, like, the naming convention or something than anything. But I do find that I have had trouble kind of latching on to who this character is. Yeah. And I think part of that is what you alluded to, which is she is kind of a big elusive threat in the first half of the book, like evil presence, major danger we're not taking seriously enough, but not really a character. And then we do get this kind of dynamic now where it's like, oh, she's super powerful, but fell for like a silly trick, right? And then after the silly trick, it's like fear, so it's a little hard to take her too seriously. So I think I appreciate what you're saying, but would not be able to say that's also like my reaction or how I felt about it.
Yeah, and I think that part of what I'm running into here is that at this point we've had 5 full books of kind of fleshing out the good guys and about 100 pages or so fleshing out the Forsaken, and I kind of need a little bit more than that from my villains frequently, right? Lanfear was really the only villain who I felt like had like some oomph and character that got me interested in her as opposed to her effects on the plot, and she just fell through a redstone door and is presumed dead along with Moraine. So I think I'm just feeling a little bit like now that Moghedien is feeling like the most prominent villain in the story, now that we've lost, Baal-Zaman and Lanfear and Ravin, I kind of just want a little more now that we're getting kind of close exposure to her and literally Nynaeve in her head. But I guess we've just got to wait until the next book for, to see whether that turns up. Boy, does Rand almost die and then Nynaeve saves him. I really don't have much else to say until we find out who falls on the floor after the fight. Any thoughts on the action sequence before we get into what happens afterwards?
Just to say again, I think the book had done a good job making Balefire feel very dangerous. So when it's so casually being thrown everywhere, even in the dream dimension, it's like, I don't think this is good. I was scared. So that's all I'd add about that section.
Yeah, definitely. And we're going to have a conversation about Balefire in about 5 minutes or so, I'm guessing. With Nynaeve, I am really curious about the way that she responds immediately after everything is over. Because she ends up basically, number one, she warns Rand. She then heals Rand. And then there's this really interesting moment where Nynaeve is afraid that Rand will kill Moghedien. And that was the moment that really stood out to me as like something's going on here. Nynaeve is really kind of thinking much more strategically and less emotionally than she would have in other places in this section. And that really stood out to me, as did kind of Rand's reaction of not caring at all about the woman who is attached to Nynaeve by a cord, who he may or may not recognize from Lews Therin's memories.
Yeah, and just to add on to that, like what it would mean that Nynaeve is now using that tool, like I guess somewhere in me, I want to believe it's just kind of trust. Like I trust Nynaeve to be doing the right thing. I'm okay with this, but it doesn't feel like Rand has been in a I trust my good old buddies that much mode. So it is a little inscrutable in that moment, but I think
I honestly think that's smart by Robert Jordan, right? I think he should not put us in Rand's head at this point, because so much of Rand's kind of setup for future books is he a good person or is he becoming cold and calculating? Not knowing what she's doing in this moment, I think, is the right move.
Well, and there's potentially why he didn't react is he's just like, oh yeah, it's cold and calculating. That's what Nynaeve is now. Like, she's using the most brutal tool we know of to control somebody awful. Like, I'm fine with that.
Yeah, that's
Ends
absolutely
justify
fair.
the means, I guess. Yeah.
I also just noted Rand sounds like an Aes Sedai here. The way that when Nynaeve asks him a question that he doesn't want to answer, he just dodges it or only answers part of her question. For example, when she's like, you cannot come here in the flesh ever again, he's like, okay, I'll leave. Right? That, I think, really showed me something in Rand that we haven't gotten to experience much because most of his scenes are from his perspective. From Nynaeve's perspective, you can really see just how different he is than even a book or two ago.
Yeah, and a reminder that they've spent a lot of time apart hearing things about each other. So it's like now getting, you have that friend you only talk to on the internet for a couple years, and you're like, oh wait, are we still friends? Are we cool? Does this still work? Maybe we shouldn't plan that like weekend away together till we figure that out or whatever.
Yeah, you're describing a lot of my former friendships. I think that the only two other quick notes that I had before we leave Teleron Riot entirely, one is that Rand says, I thought it was you channeling Or, and then he kind of trails off. And anytime that there is a unspoken someone else, I'm always curious who Rand is thinking or, who he thinks it might be, right? Elaine and Egwene feel like very reasonable, fill in the blanks there. But there's also a part of me that wonders if Rand had like a brief, like hopeful, maybe it was Moraine in this weird alternate shadowy place and didn't want to bring himself to say that. I thought that was a really interesting moment. And then obviously we're going to have to at least briefly talk about Rand saying Elaine should forget about me and you should forget about Lan. But talk about the other stuff first.
My mind went to Moraine, and it was, again, like that Obi-Wan Kenobi talks to Luke Skywalker. He's like, I thought maybe she would still be felt here or something like that. Like, I'd still know her presence. You also promised a conversation on Balefire that I think we've now skipped.
No, we have not skipped it.
Okay. And so I think so my mind went to Moraine, and then I thought the lines about like you should forget about Lan just feel so hollow, right? Like in this kind of structure, it's like, yes, the smart thing would be to ignore your love and just go live your own lives, but I never for a second think any of them are going to do this. So it's kind of creating fake tension for me. Like, don't worry, we're still going to be talking and thinking about each other an awful lot for a book or so.
And then we got the interesting cliffhanger. Nynaeve knows where Moghedien is. Are you excited? Do you have predictions? Anything else before we then talk about Balefire?
Well, just make sure that I understood it correctly. So based on facts that Moghedien kind of reveals that she knows.
Yep.
The Nynaeve draws the conclusion that she is in Salidara with them.
Salidar, yeah.
Salidar. I always fall for the trick name, the Salidara. So she's in Salidar. Does that mean she is within the Aes Sedai camp, what I've referred to as the Resistance, or we're not entirely sure?
We don't know for sure. I think either being in that camp is a possibility, or she could have been one of the three women who was traveling with them who came on in Samara. But either way, presumably she drinks fork root, she falls asleep and cannot wake for some time, and Nynaeve will be able, hopefully, to figure out who she is in the meantime.
Go stab her while she's asleep. Just baby Hitler. Just
That's
totally.
the goal. Yeah.
Okay, well, and of course you did not say it, but reminding us of those three women who came along, we know Min found them to be deeply, deeply upsetting. So that seems like a likely candidate.
Yeah.
But there's also, as I recall, just a huge number of people gathering there. Many men for the army and so on, but one would assume a lot of women and support around there.
It sounds like at least 100 Aes Sedai, so a woman who could channel would not be noticed in the area, and there are a lot of opportunities for Moghedien to go unnoticed in that. I think that's exactly the right read. Balefire gets some really interesting call-outs here, right? So, number one, Moraine was wrong. The Forsaken are not afraid to use balefire. As a result, Rand isn't either, and that causes widespread destruction that by the end of the chapter we realize could have been a whole lot worse, right? Burning people out of the pattern backwards is weird and scary. 2, a very minor detail, but one that I thought was really interesting, Luz Sit Theron stops talking to Rand as soon as he channels balefire. Finally, boy, does balefire create all sorts of weird plot-holy things now that we know that it can literally undo death over the course of, 10, 15 minutes? Something like that. So this feels like a really big kind of monumental power that we're going to need to track and see how it influences things, especially as Moraine says, if you use it too much, the world falls apart. So what were your thoughts on kind of how balefire kind of finally gets revealed here as opposed to just being discussed many times prior?
Well, first of all, I'm really glad I saw Tenet and can track the movement of plots forward and backwards at the same time. The combination of things you just listed is weird because it in some ways is like a leveling up and a leveling down. It's like it's more common than we might have imagined, and the Forsaken are less afraid of it, and Rand is less afraid of it. But then it's more destructive.
Yep.
I think I've alluded to this before. I always love in the second Austin Powers movie when he starts to piece together how like time travel will work.
Yeah.
And he says, "Oh no, I've gone cross-eyed." And Basil Exposition just looks at him and says, "I don't think you should worry about it." And then he looks at the camera and says, "And I don't think any of you should worry about this either."
We need to talk more about Austin Powers on this podcast. Please continue.
Especially Austin Powers lesser sequels, which I think isn't there. I think there's another one coming pretty soon.
I hope so.
So it feels like that to me at the moment, that it is so bizarre and difficult to understand that I'm kind of okay with it at the moment as just a kind of deus ex machina, like, oh, don't worry, everybody's fine. But when I start to think about like how serious that could become and how, to steal your word, unstable things could be, I have trouble kind of envisioning what that is. So I'm not sure how to take that.
That's totally fair. I will also just note at this point, Mat has kind of sort of died twice. So he is a really lucky boy. Other than that, I don't really have much at the end of this chapter. We get a report that there are still Trollocs in the city, there are ongoing battles, but it seems like Rand more or less accomplished all of his goals in Caemlyn. Any last thoughts on the chapter before we get to the second and final of our chapters for this book?
Oof. No, let's push onward from burning threads to glowing embers.
Rand thinks that Aviendha would have chased off after the Trollocs if not for him and the maiden stopping her. Mat complains about his destiny, even as Rand thinks that he has accepted it, and Rand turns towards Nynaeve, who reports that the city is sealed off until all of the Trollocs are killed, but she notes that many of the Merdrail will likely escape because of their ability to fade into shadows. Samara appears with food, and Aviendha told them that he has not eaten, and Rand is very upset that none of the servants have returned to the castle, because apparently the cooking is extremely poor. As he walks out, he spots an older man, clearly not from Andor, who approaches and introduces himself as Davram Bashir, and Bashir asks if Morgase still lives, but Rand says that Gabriel killed her, and then he killed Gabriel. Bashir asks if Rand is king now, but he says he intends Elaine for the throne, as she has a right to it, and then Bashir reports that Mazrim Tayyim has escaped from the tower, and Bashir was sent to hunt him down. Rand says that he cannot have him, because he is announcing an amnesty for those men who can channel in order to battle the dark. Bashir asks if he intends to conquer the world, but Rand says he will if he must, but he will accept any rulers who come to him as allies. Rand worries that there is too much chaos in the world and he needs to stop it so that they can fight the dark as one united force. Bashir says that he thinks the Borderlanders will support him because they know well the risks of the Blight, and he eventually pledges himself to Rand, at least temporarily, and allows him to use his soldiers, despite the fact that Rand warns him that they are all potentially going to die. We then switch into Asmodian's point of view as he walks away from Mat and Aviendha, very upset that they weren't listening to his music, and he avoids the Aiel because too many of them saw him while he was dead and they note it. He eventually laments not being immortal now that he no longer has his link to the Dark One, but he resolves to hold on as long as he possibly can. But once he arrives in a small room, he experiences a shock, begins bleeding, and then dies. We switch into Morghase's point of view, who studies Talonvor, upset that Gareth Brine was not at his home and has ridden away after people who burned down their barn. Now she rides through Altara, and Linny thinks that that Morghase needs to give more attention to Talonvor and maybe even should start, dating him or whatever. But Morghase resists the idea and tells Linny not to give Talonvor any ideas. Morghase says that she will continue to find allies wherever she can, and we learn that they are about to enter Amadisia, which means that Morghase may be making some very not nice white-cloaked allies. Greg, what were your thoughts on the finishing of this chapter? We can also talk about the prophecy at the end if you want, but I don't think there's anything there.
Well, when I was just listening to your summary, I was demanding in my head some map talk, because there's a lot of names and places thrown into what you just explained. And I will say that when I read this chapter, I did not look at the map. And mentally, I was putting a lot of what was being described up in the kind of northern area that I thought Perrin's wife, Fail was from, up there. But having now listened to your summary and looking at the map actively, we are much more down in the heat of the south and kind of those areas.
So, interestingly, that is where Morghase is. But Davram Bashir is, obviously, he is now Perrin's father-in-law. He is from the northwest in Saldia. So depending on which you're talking about, yes, that is correct. But it is worth noting, Morghase has gone southwest and now seems imminently towards, likely, the White Cloaks if she's about to enter Amadisia.
And is much further away than I would have guessed from Cainwyn. Like, she covered some continents since we last saw her.
This book actually takes place over a much kind of larger time frame than many of the ones that came before it. There's a lot more like 2 weeks later in this book than there are otherwise. So I think it is notable just how far she's traveled. I do think we should jump to the beginning of the chapter just so that we kind of don't forget anything. Number one, Aviendha just makes me laugh every time. The fact that she literally died and then was like, no, I want to chase after the Trollocs. That makes me laugh. And just kind of Rand, like, getting a moment to observe them and almost kind of be like, wow, I can't believe they're all alive. It worked for me a little bit, even though it doesn't do anything else other than give us tiny itty-bitty glimpses into character. Did you have any thoughts about that scene before we kind of got to what feels like the important part when Bashir arrives?
No, I mean, it does feel like every superhero movie or like a Ghostbusters movie or something where like all the dead people like get to stand up and there's like 2 or 3 wisecracks and then we move on. And it's like, nope, don't worry, nothing happened. So yeah, a good for a chuckle. Good that they're all back and onward.
So, Perrin's father-in-law is here, which presumably means that he is not with Perrin, unlike what you were expecting throughout this book. And he brings some really interesting news that also causes Rand to give us some very interesting news. So I'm kind of curious your take on the politics here, right? Because we've got one, Davram Bashir has come south, which means that he is separated from the Queen. Second, we get this idea that Mazrim Taim has escaped, and so he is after him. And then finally, Rand responds by this really fascinating note. He's going to let men channel and is presumably creating somewhere for them to come and learn to do so they can fight in the last battle. All of that together really, I think, sets up some fun stuff for the next book. What is your take on it? What are you expecting to come out of it? This feels like the kind of like post-credit sequence where we get the hint at the Avengers initiative forming or whatever. What are you expecting to come of all of this?
I think the one that stood out, I didn't care that much about their marriage being strained or whatever, the separation from the Queen. I was like, yeah, okay, whatever. But the men being allowed to channel now, and essentially we don't need to police these false dragons, and we're going to just let men go is an interesting question. And I mean, he grounds it in, well, I'm not going mad. And we're like, well, easy off. Like,
I don't even know if his point is I'm not going mad. It's if I'm allowed to go mad, they should be too.
And so that seems to me the most consequential of the events explained there. And I immediately thought of Logain, which, we've said for a long time, why is this character hanging around? He was stilled, correct? So he shouldn't be able to.
If he's a man, but yes.
Gentled. And yet we've also had these hints that we seem to think there might be a way to undo that. And so, it just puts some pieces onto the game board that I wasn't expecting to be on the game board.
Yeah, and I just want to make sure we note also Mazrim Taim is not gentled, and so there is at least one kind of really competent channeler out there, potentially, especially given what happens in our next point of view. Rand may have need for someone who could teach or instruct him in the ways of channeling. Other than that, I think that Bashir just immediately kind of pledging himself to Rand with basically no need for any preamble other than he didn't kill Morghedien is really telling, right? I'm not sure if this is desperation or why Bashir is kind of going along like this, but it felt like this was kind of really being set up as like Bashir is leading an opposing force and he's not representing, and there could be conflict because he came for Taim and he's not allowed to, and instead Bashir is just like, okay, cool, whatever you say, I'm in. And that really surprised me. What was your take there?
I mean, it fits this pattern that like the whole continent is in chaos, and so if you have a steady hand that is tied into like whatever's gonna happen is like centered around him, then I can see you just being like, yeah, cool, whatever you say, because I can't stop it anyway. I might as well just go with it.
Yeah. I also do just want to note, you mentioned looking at the map earlier. At this point, Rand is the de facto king of Tyr and holds the throne, although has not sat on it in both Caemlyn and Cairhien. That means that basically the entire southeast portion of the continent is in his hands now. And if Bashir is saying that the Borderlanders will all very likely support him, that puts the northern quadrant of the map all within his hands. We're very rapidly reaching the point where Rand is the most powerful person in the world, if he wasn't already. I think that kind of consolidation is just worth noting as we move into what weirdly is the second third of this series. We finally made it to 33%, Greg. Any thoughts on kind of the state of the world before we jump into our last couple POVs?
Can you just, as a reminder, where is this guy from? What city is Perrin's father-in-law from?
Davram Bashir is from the country of Saldia in the northwest.
Right on the crease of the map, if you're looking at the same one I am.
Sounds right, yeah.
Where the pages meet. And so that would be separate from, but I assume culturally linked to kind of the ways in which the like land people in Faldara and Falmoran kind of exist. I mean, there's a lot of continent between those regions.
I think
but in terms of
I was going to say, I think there are 4 borderland countries, the 4 northern ones. It's like Faldara and I think Arafel maybe, and Saldia and one other. I'm not looking at the map.
Kandor?
Kandor, yeah. Those plus Once Upon a Time Malkir are all, as you're saying, very culturally similar because they all share the fact that they have a border with the Blight.
And then the other thing I was just going to add based on what you were just describing, like you're right. Rand's got a big chunk of the risk board down on the bottom and is being told at least he could control a big chunk of the northern. So notably, Tar Valon is right in the middle of that and would prevent you from being totally secure and start attacking those other regions. We also, I'm also noting that it's all the parts that don't touch the Shan-Chan, most likely, if they were to arrive back where they were before. So I still have some questions about how stable this map game is getting to be. But as you alluded to, like that's all just good deep tease for future books.
And you want to talk about deep tease for future books? You have no idea how many pages I read on the early like blog style internet about who killed Asmodean. Oh my God, this was the thing to be talking about for a decade of my life online. I can't say much here, obviously. What are your thoughts on Asmodian's death? What do you think this means for Rand now that he has basically lost all of his mentor figures? And did you care at all?
Whoop, sorry, I leaned forward and my light went off in like a very dramatic fashion, but we're not.
It was
recording
pretty
video.
crazy if you were looking at video.
And again, my shirtless in the dark, but somehow my white torso glowed still. So glad that I'm putting that out there on the internet just as a visual. Gosh, what were we talking about? I think this was a pretty stirring moment. I don't particularly find Asmodian a threat anymore, so it felt like clearing another piece off the board. Like, let's just say that this is there. Now, we've already played the game of, there's a secret Forsaken, so to me, while that might be the most obvious place to go, doesn't seem like a likely explanation. So I actually think my theorizing would go more to somebody good who figured out who this really was and what they had done, and just decide to end it themselves, like a Mat type.
Other than playing a bunch of time like the internet used to, trying to figure out the geography of this scene and what room he walked into and who might have been talking to Rand and could have walked away to that room like the internet used to, I think the only meaningful clue that we really get here is that Asmodian is surprised to see the person before he notices that he has been injured. So his shock is not, oh no, you killed me. It is you. And then the pain, right? So I think that is really notable in the sense that it doesn't eliminate all of the people in Rand's kind of retinue, but it does make us need to wonder, like, why would Asmodian be surprised to see them there?
You've got what I need. You say he's just a friend. So he just wanted to sing. That's all. He was just starting to, and then he died. And everybody says they want to die with a song in their heart. So that was his.
He is a bard. You're not wrong. I literally think the last POV of this chapter is just Robert Jordan going, oh, some of the readers might think Morghese is actually dead if I don't show them he's alive. I don't think there was really much else here other than we're clearly setting up Morghese and Talonvor. And then as I hinted at, I think the most fun thing you can do is look at the map and realize which city she is most likely headed to and what that means for Morghese. Thoughts on this last POV?
That seems exactly right to me. And, I had the benefit of you when we were back, and I could be like, wait, she's not dead, right? Like, we know that. And so I can see why that would be useful here to those without a podcast companion. But I guess then my surprise, again, is I kind of placed her, like, in the woods outside Andor, and she'll just come back. So to have her very much in the messiest part of things is a little more troubling. So I like that as a deep tease.
And I do think there are some notes in this section that we've gotten hints at before, but she very clearly does not have any allies left in Andor, and I think that is a much more interesting place to leave her than, as you say, kind of able to just turn around and take the throne back anytime she wants to. Given that we're there, we're not really going to say much about how much we liked the book overall. That is for next week. But how did this conclusion land for you? Is there anything you want to say about the prophecy at the end? Were there any kind of curveballs you weren't expecting? And is there any kind of predictions you want to get on the record before we log off and start thinking about the next book?
Again, I would just say it felt satisfying, and there were definitely weeks. I mean, I don't have to tell listeners this. Weeks I felt like this book really wasn't getting going, and I do want to sit a little bit more and think about the experience as a whole. But how many times have I sat through a movie where I was like, wow, that hour and a half sucked, but the last 30 minutes was so good, and it's kind of in that camp at the moment for me. So satisfying, I do think it is logical, but also just slightly frustrating that so much seems to be on casting forward now and building more to come. Whereas, it's only natural that, and Robert Jordan's got to do it, but it did feel like this felt a little less complete in some ways. So I want to explore those feelings in book therapy with you next week as we look back on this experience. But, I think you're right to say it's worth celebrating. I mean, 5 books down, and I maybe got bored a little bit tonight, and I was looking at my inside cover, and it's like, so when you count the full 15, that includes The New Spring, which is a
very,
prequel
very short
novel, right?
Yes, correct.
Is that accurate? Well, Tylor has frozen, and I don't know when he'll be back or if he'll be back. So instead of hearing his delightful response to that question, we're going to save that for next week. And so we really do thank you for being on this journey. Remember, go pick up your copy of Lord of Chaos. Make sure that you start reading, even though next week is a non-chapter book. And we will find our way through next time through the glass columns.
So ends another episode of Through the Glass Columns. We thank you for joining us and continuing with us on our quest to cover all of the Wheel of Time in our own sweet time.
This podcast features original content developed by Tylor Orm and Greg Cass and is not in any way affiliated with, associated with, or condoned by the Robert Jordan Estate, Tor Fantasy, Amazon, or our wives. All content is intended for entertainment and educational purposes only.
If you're enjoying this podcast, please seek out the books from your local bookshop or library and join us as we continue our journey. If you'd like to contact us to share your thoughts or give feedback, find us on Instagram or Threads by searching Through the Glass Columns.
Thank you once again for being a part of this community. If you're enjoying the show, please subscribe, leave us a review wherever you are listening, and recommend this show on your social media to help us grow our community. We look forward to welcoming you back next time on Through the Glass Columns.